Good afternoon. And wow. I am Cappy Powell, president of the Johann Fust Library Foundation Board. The mission of our board is to maintain and preserve the buildings and gardens of the library while providing a literary and cultural center for the residents and visitors of Boca Grande. Last month, we heard from Sally Bedell Smith. She has written several books about the British royal family, and most recently, a book about King Charles VI and Queen Elizabeth. For some of you here today, this may be the first time you have attended one of our programs. That is because it's about another king, the Silver King, the Tarpon. On behalf of our board and our foundation staff, welcome to all of you. Tom McGuane is a writer whose works include novels, short fiction, and several screenplays, many of which are devoted to his love of the outdoors. He studied the craft of writing and literature at Michigan State, Harvard, and Yale. He was a Wallace Stegner Fellow, and in 2010, he became a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. That same year, he was named by Fly Rod and Reel magazine Fly Rod and Angler of the Year. He is also a member of the Fly Fishing Hall of Fame. It was hard for me to condense his bio down so that we get to hear Monte. In 1970, Tom moved to Key West to write and to fish. He and his friends had the reputation as being the merry pranksters of the tarpon world. Fortunately for all of us, Tom and Lori now make Boca Grande their winter home. Tom is a wonderful friend of the Johann Fust Library Foundation, and I am thrilled that our neighbor, Tom McGuane, is here today to introduce our speaker, Monte Burke.
I think you all need to hear from a deaf octogenarian from time to time. I'm really happy to be doing this because I'm a big fan of this author and of this book and of the things that led up to him, to the book itself. He's been a really industrious journalist at Forbes, has written dozens and dozens of profiles in addition to things that possibly never interested him, but he really developed incredible chops for research. And his biography, his best-selling biography of Nick Saban, which I think was #1 bestseller. It's on the New York Times, as I recall. Close enough. And interestingly, he interviewed at least 250 people. It's widely regarded as a detailed, careful, mostly admiring portrait of this exceptional college coach. But naturally, Saban didn't think it was nice enough and went on a kind of a rant that our writer today responded to formally and powerfully. Saban concluded the only person who could really write a proper biography of him was Nick Saban himself. So. Anyway, this book is so good and so well done. The narrative is so strong that you don't need to really have any interest in fishing to enjoy it. The portraits of the adversaries, the people who are fishing against each other, trying to set records, are so detailed that you can decide whether you like them or not. One of them struck me as a little bit over the top in his dedication, his obsession with fishing. And I kept thinking of a thing that our friend Yvonne Chenard, our mutual friend Yvonne Chenard, said: the best fish are caught by the worst people. But this is this kind of fishing. I grew up, because of my age and state, I grew up in the era when fly fishing was called the contemplative sport. There's not a lot contemplative about fishing for records and tournament fishing. But nobody ever really caught the obsessive nature of this. And Monte is kind of a specialist in obsessives, and not just Sabin, but a lot of his portraits, and he's done wonderful portraits in Forbes, have been really, that's your theme, isn't it, in a way? And yet, he told me recently, or I learned this recently, he wouldn't under any circumstances kill a tarpon, even if it was the world's record. So he has a useful detachment from his subject. And these people are great fishermen. They can afford to do this. In some cases, they could afford to fly in hookers from New Orleans. Since it's Florida, the drug dealers came on their own. So some of these anglers saved on airline tickets for the dope dealers. But it's such a powerful story, and it's a study in struggle, and the characters all the way down. One of them, for example, to give you an idea of the cast of characters, one of them, Bobby Era, was a mafioso, very good fisherman, college golfer. When he went to prison for his lash up with the cocaine cowboys of Miami, Carl Hyacin called me and he said, you know, he's still killing people from prison. But he was a driven tarpon fisherman and a very good one. But you wouldn't want to intercept one of his fish in the boat. I understand he was armed. Anyway, I can't recommend this enough. This is a great book. It's a great fishing book. It really is a work of literature because of the extraordinary detail of the portraits, especially, and the nice, clean prose that he writes, in which I admire on its own. So please welcome Monte.
Thank you very much. If you had told 17-year-old me, all hopped up on reading 92 in the Shade and The Longest Silence and Nothing But Blue Skies, that Tom McGuane would be introducing me, or if you told a 40-year-old me, by the way, that, I would have looked you straight in the eye and said, you know, sniffing glue isn't good for you. But seriously, what a thrill. Thank you, Tom. Thanks for that lovely introduction. You can probably tell I'm a big fan of Tom's. I've loved and tried to emulate his prose for literally decades. I think he's clearly one of the best short story writers of his generation, if not the best. I love his novels. And when it comes to writing about angling, I think he did something maybe he didn't even know he was doing. He dared to treat that writing with the same seriousness that with everything else he did, with the same wit, with the same penchant for beautiful sentences. And that did something important. It kind of opened up a window for the rest of us. It gave the rest of us the permission to at least attempt to do the same thing. I've written this before, but we are all pale disciples, but at least we have a standard to which to aspire. We all need our North Star. And Tom and his writing really are, in a very real sense, responsible for this book I'm going to talk about today. I'm not so sure that I would have been able to kind of envision it without having read his prose first. And I also have to thank Tom for kind of setting this whole thing in motion here. He emailed Bobby and got this going. And Bobby, I want to thank you especially for doing all this work. This is amazing, for this wonderful event, and the foundation as well. This is a beautiful library. It's always great to have. I just finished Susan Orlean's book about libraries, and they're so essential to communities. And thank you for being such a fierce and cheerful advocate for writers and writing. And I want to thank two of my three daughters who have made the trip here with me today, Dylan and Lulu. They're actually on spring break right now, and this is exactly how they envisioned it would go. To watch their dad drone on yet again about what Tom's wife Lori calls the F word. But most of all, I want to thank all of you out there for coming here today. This is a busy and distracting world. There's a million other things you could be doing. You could be working, you could be napping, you could be fishing, you could be doing your taxes, but you're here, and I'm very flattered and very happy. It's all a testament to you, Bobby, and the foundation. So as Tom mentioned, I could talk about a couple things today. I could talk to you about college football coaches. I could talk to you about what it was like to work in a Manhattan magazine on the last bit of the good old days and the first part of the bad new days. I could talk about fishing in New York City if you want, but since we're in Boca Grande, I thought it was Lords of the Fly was the right subject. This being the tarpon capital of the world is what I read in something yesterday. I love talking about this book. It was a total passion project. During the meat of the pandemic, when I was working on it, I would wake up at 4:30 in the morning, no alarm needed, just get up, get a cup of coffee, sit down and work on it. It was like I just kind of wanted to hang out with it and hang out with the characters. I can talk a little bit about the genesis of the book. So in 2010, I was asked by the magazine Grande to do a feature profile of Steve Huff, who's a legendary Keys guide who now lives in Everglades City. And for that story, I spent 2 days with Steve on his boat. And I'm going to read a little section at the end here, which will explain a little more about that. But suffice it to say that Steve and I hit it off, and we started to fish together every year. And over the years, when I would get together with Steve, whether it was on the boat or whether it was back home over dinner, he would frequently mention a word to me, and that word was homosassa. Which to me sounded poetic and kind of enchanting right off the bat. And then he started telling me the stories of the wild times there in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when homosassa was pretty much the epicenter of the fishing world. I think it's a time that you could argue was kind of the apex moment in fly fishing, and maybe fishing itself, when you had the world's best fly anglers, along with the world's best fly guides, all gathered together at the same time, every year in pursuit of the same goal, which was to catch the world record tarpon on the fly. I've thought about this a little bit, and to me it's kind of like the angling equivalent. If you could somehow have Tiger Woods, Jack Nicklaus, Ben Hogan, Bobby Jones, Sam Snead, all show up somehow in their primes at Augusta every year and play for a trophy. You had Billy Pate, you had Lefty Cray, Stu App, Tom Evans, Ted Williams, Carl Navarre Sr. and Jr., Jimmy Lopez, Al Pfluger, all those guys were in a homosassa chasing after the record. Flip Pallett, Chico Fernandez, Jim Harrison, all stopped by for a bit. The list of guides was unbelievable. Bill Curtis, Eddie Whiteman, Jim Brewer, Billy Knowles, Nat Ragland, Lee Baker, Hal Chittum. So Steve would tell me all about all this craziness on the water, and then tell me about the absolute insanity off of the water. So my interest at that point was piqued. And then a few years after that, Garden Gun asked me to go write a profile about a man named Andy Mill, who the former U.S. ski team member and the champion tarpon tournament angler. And Andy, of course, is a font of tarpon info, and he mentioned homosassa and all the people who were there. So then, fast forward just a few years after that, we're now in 2018, I believe. Andy called me one evening and he said that I had to write a book about homosassa and about this era, that it was slipping away. Again, my interest was piqued, but I wasn't kind of fully on board. And then he gave me the phone number of a man named Tom Evans. Now, Tom lives part-time in Vermont, so I drove up from Brooklyn and sat and listened to this large, gravelly-voiced, physically banged-up guy for 2 straight days. And I'll never forget it. I drove home in a snowstorm thinking, holy cow, this is a book. But there was a rub, and a pretty serious one. My agent and the editors with whom I'd worked weren't all that gung-ho, at least not immediately. I'd come off writing 2 books about college football coaches. A fishing book was not exactly what everyone had in mind for my next venture. There are, believe it or not, more people who want to read about college football than fly fishing for tarpon. I know, I couldn't believe it either. But at this point, I felt like this was a book that I had to do. It was sort of stuck right here. Nothing else could pass until this kind of came out. So I sat down, wrote a proposal, gave it to my agent, and he said, all right, that looks good to me. So we sold it to a publisher, and kind of off we went. And as Tom mentioned, or alluded to anyway, what's interesting is I actually have very little interest, if any interest at all, in fishing for world records. But what does interest me, whether it's in books about Nick Saban or stories about George H.W. Bush or about hedge funders or entrepreneurs or whatever, is obsession. And that to me was the allure of writing all about this. Obsession can lead people to amazing feats. It led people to the moon and to the top of Everest. And it can also serve in another purpose, kind of in a smaller sense. It can be the thing that gets you out of bed in the morning, that animates you, that gives your life its meaning, really. Obsessions, no matter how inconsequential they seem, like baseball card collecting or fly fishing for tarpon with a fly, are sort of what make the world go round. But like many things, they can and often are taken too far, and they can crush you. I think of the great Sylvia Plath quote. She said, "I desire the things which will destroy me in the end." I've always loved that. So the characters in this book break everything. They break the rods, they break the lines, hooks, marriages, even themselves, in the pursuit of something that seems so trivial to the rest of the world. Believe me, when I was back in Brooklyn and would tell people that I was working on this book and give them the subject matter, their eyes would glaze over. I was just happy at that point that I wasn't working on a book about permit. They'd be like, wait, you're doing a book about fishing licenses? And of course, in the end, it was not only hooks and rods and marriages and lives that were destroyed, it was the place itself, Homosassa. Because of the crowds, because of the environmental degradation, the fishing in Homosassa fell off a cliff starting in the 1980s. So this kind of book had, or at least the book I had in my head, this had a lot of elements that I really liked. It seemed fascinating, it seemed sort of wistful, it seemed funny, so I was in. It helps too that I've always believed that angling, the sport, the pastime, whatever you want to call it, is particularly suited to storytelling. Fly fishing in particular. Every cast, after all, forms an actual arc, or most of them anyway. But that storytelling begins well in advance of the act of actually casting for a fish. It starts with the daydreams that can sneak up on any committed angler at any random time, when a piece of water is glimpsed under a bridge, on a long drive, or during a business meeting. It goes into the planning of a fishing trip, the thinking through of what you'll bring, the conditions you'll face, who'll be there with you, all the strategizing and preparatory tying of flies and leaders. It happens before you hit the water, when you pull your fly rod from its tube and join the blanks and then hold it up to your eye to sight it through the big snake guide. When you attach the reel and thread the fly line through the guides and tie a fly to the leader and then lean the rod against the car and gaze at that ensemble of equipment that to some of us is achingly beautiful in its potential energy. It also happens with the silent internal monologue that takes place in your head throughout the day on the water. The questions, the answers, the self-castigation, the self-correction, the self-satisfaction. For fly fishing is very much a sport of the mind. Even when fishing with a guide or someone else in a boat or on a river, you're mostly within your own head, constructing your own narrative, perhaps even thinking ahead to the obligatory stories you must give voice to at the end of the day. The big one that got away, the big one that didn't. Fishing, of course, is often employed as allegory. Jesus told his fishing apostles, Peter and Andrew, to cast aside their nets and follow him and become fishers of men. The ancient Chinese proverb warns, quote, "The fish sees the bait, not the hook. A person sees the gain, not the danger." There's the dignity of Hemingway's aging Santiago and Melville's, quote, "grand, ungodly, godlike Ahab." Stories about fly fishing have been told for nearly 2,000 years. Trout and Atlantic salmon fishing, the oldest varieties of sport, make up a good bit of the literature, sort of in the way that baseball dominates the literary world of spectator sports in the United States. But pretty much anything you can catch on a rod and reel has been celebrated in writing. As I mentioned in the book, Lords of Fly, there's some numbnut I know who even wrote an entire book about largemouth bass. Tarpon are fairly well covered when it comes to the how to catch 'em books, but the story in Lords of the Fly about the glory years in Homosassa, but also what led up to that point in time and what has happened since in this world, is what intrigued me most. It has to do with the why in fishing. Everything within it is linked, quote, "an unbroken chain of events flowing one out of another," as Chekhov wrote, connecting the past to the present. And when one end of the story is touched, as Chekhov continued, the other end quivered. It contains joyous discovery, furious competition, over-the-top obsession, incredible willpower, heartbreaking falls from grace. It details an uncertain future. It sheds some light on the motivations of man and possibly reflects, in some refracted way, something larger about our current state. I think you could argue, too, that tarpon fishing, especially fly fishing for tarpon, also lends itself to storytelling. One of the most interesting aspects of fly fishing for big tarpon, for me anyway, is that it's actually kind of scary with the big fish. The hookup and the succeeding few moments are usually a blur. Everything goes absolutely haywire and there's no time for thoughts. But when the chaos subsides, reality sets in, and the angler becomes suddenly cognizant of what he or she will have to endure in order to actually land the fish. On nearly every morning before going out on the water to fish for big tarpon, I've been filled with a sense of utter excitement, but also a touch of dread, because I know what I and the fish may have to go through. Hemingway once said that most honest and skillful anglers who love big fish do so because the fish whips them, maybe. Or maybe it's more honest to admit that getting whipped inspires a whole host of uncomfortable thoughts and emotions. I know that if I hook a big tarpon, say one of over 100 pounds, the fight will exhaust me and the fish physically. I also know that the fight will push me mentally about as far as I'd like to go. There are times during the fight with a big tarpon when you wonder how much more you can take, when you wonder what it would mean for your psyche if you just gave up. The likelihood that you will feel shame and disappointment is usually enough to keep you going. We are frauds, the author and tarpon angler Randy Wayne White once wrote. Megalops, which is the scientific name for tarpon, is not. In nearly every other type of fly fishing, say for bonefish or trout or salmon, a hooked fish really only requires that the angler hold the rod steady, apply a bit of pressure, and reel in the line when the fish has begun to exhaust itself after a few runs. That is not the case with big tarpon. With these fish, the angler must fight too, pulling on the rod, which is about 5 ounces of pliable graphite, and the fish nearly as hard as he or she can. And anytime the angler pauses to rest, the fish gets a breather as well, and as often as not, will resume the battle with even more vigor. The tarpon is a fish, needless to say, that is in much better shape than the vast majority of its pursuers. Most every guide who has attempted to gaff a big tarpon has been pulled into the water by the fish. In his early guiding years, Steve Huff once had a client who hooked a fish and started to play it very slowly, as if in a trance. Quote, I told him he needed to bear down on the fish because there are only 2 things that could happen. He would land the fish or he would lose it, Huff says. Little did I know there was actually a third scenario. With the fish still attached, Huff's client suddenly collapsed face first onto the bow, unconscious. Huff broke off the fish and raced back to the dock at full speed, but the man was already dead. His aorta had ruptured. Everything has to go perfectly or very close to it to actually land a big tarpon. The hook can pull or break, the leader or line or rod can too. So can an angler's willpower, which is, along with some knowledge of how to employ angles and leverage, far more important than his or her physical strength. This mixture of the mental and physical, of excitement and dread, is the high of tarpon fly fishing. Kant once described the sublime as beauty mixed with terror. And just as a side note, Tom and I were up here talking about this earlier. I've gotten to the point now where when I hook a tarpon, I fish it really hard for 20 minutes, and if it's not at the boat, I ping it off. It's not fair to the fish, and it ain't fair to me either. So I think that's probably the way to do it. So we had storytelling, we had kind of what led up to Homosassa, we had the actual event itself, what happened in Homosassa, and then what came out of it. And I felt like that was my directive when I went for this book. And what was so cool about this entire project was something I totally discovered along the way, that indeed everything in this specific world was interconnected, that unbroken chain of events that Chekhov wrote about. Fly fishing started with the Macedonians casting a little tiny piece of red thread, which is what the first fly ever used for trout, and that was around 200 AD. And the story winds through the growth of fly fishing in England and the introduction of the sport in the United States, and through a man named A.W. Dimmock, who was an intrepid angler / architect / gold speculator, whose book of Tarpon is the seminal piece of literature on the topic. Dimmock, as fate would have it, hooked his first tarpon in the mouth of the Homosassa River in 1882. That unbroken chain winds through the first anglers who targeted tarpon with a fly to some kids in Miami, or Miami, as they said, who became wholly obsessed with tarpon, to a group of artists, which included Tom, who also became wholly obsessed with tarpon, to the record chasers, all the way up to us. So I was in. At this point, I had all this kind of knowledge in my head. I just needed a way to kind of tell the story, a way to frame it. And after a little more reporting, it dawned on me that there was really only one way to do this. So if there is a central character in the book, besides the tarpon, of course, it is Tom Evans. Evans, who is 85, is certainly not everyone's cup of tea. He's brusque, outspoken, and many would say downright rude. He is, as I describe in the book, a bull who is always very pleased to find himself in a china shop. I start the book with Evans. He pops up throughout it, and then I end it with him. His relationship with Huff, who guided him for many years, is fascinating to me. His relationship to everyone else in the book is also fascinating, as well as his relationship to the actual fish itself. But there's another reason why I think he worked well as a main character. The arc of his physical and mental life very much mirrors the arc of the Homosassa tarpon fishery. Homosassa was once the epicenter of the fly fishing world. It's hallowed ground, it's Yankee Stadium, it's El Capitan. And once thousands, if not 10,000, very large tarpon used to visit it every single May. And then, suddenly, they just stopped. Pressure and attention from the world record chase had something to do with this, but water issues were the bigger reason. And water, by the way, is the story of Florida. From the stopped-up Everglades to the ever-encroaching ocean to the disappearing aquifers. And it's only going to become a bigger story. So by the late 1980s, with Homosassa pretty much done, all of the record chasers had left, all except for Tom Evans. He kept going back to Homosassa year after year, even after it declined, becoming the epitome of Einstein's definition of insanity. He was just an irresistible character. So over the years, age, surgeries, and other things have caught up to Evans. He was a former collegiate nose tackle and a wrestler, to the point where in the last decade or so, he can stand for only a few minutes at a time. His boat is rigged especially for him, with a chair and a rope connected to a cage on the bow that keeps him from falling overboard. Physically, he got worse and worse every year, and yet he still went and he fished every day. His decline corresponded with the decline of his favorite fishery. Brooke Jarvis, writing in the New York Times Magazine about the disappearance of insects, said that humans deal with environmental degradation, with places not being as abundant as they once were, through a trick of the mind. Quote, "The world never feels fallen because we grow accustomed to the fall," she wrote. Evans became accustomed to both his own fall and the fall of Homosassa, but he never stopped going for the month of May every year. He's missed just 3 seasons in the last 45 years. One because of a work emergency, one when he disastrously went to the Panhandle to fish with a guide named David Mangum, and one because of the pandemic. I calculated that he has spent more than 3.5 years of his life floating on the flats of Homosassa. So in the end, there's the central question of the book that I had to attempt to answer, which gets back to obsession. And that question is why? Why had Tom Evans kept going back every year after year, as the fishery and his physical health declined? Why would someone do that? That question is posited and answered somewhat, I think, in the last paragraph of the book, but not totally answered, I don't think, which I kind of liked. Okay, so I was going to do a little reading, if we have time for a little reading. Okay, great. So this is actually from the book. I printed it out. It's easier for me to read now. And this is about Steve Huff. This is actually a story of the first tarpon I ever caught. Okay. We skid turns through the labyrinth of backcountry mangroves. A few stars are visible in the pale early morning light, but they are fading, soon to be hidden again. I'm sitting in the back of the skiff next to Steve Huff, who holds the tiller under his armpit. He is a man completely within his element. As all the scenery in the Everglades, the green vegetation on the banks, the blue sky and water blends together, I can't help but voice the cliched thought: how in the hell would I get out of here if you keeled over? Huff's smile straightens out his white mustache. You wouldn't. I gaze at his hands for maybe the 3rd time that morning. You might find this strange, but I can't help it. Stories are worn into those hands, maybe even commandments. They are gnarled by calluses and deeply etched scars, parched by decades in the sun. They look like old mangroves, whited out by the elements. They have handled world record tarpon, bonefish, and permit. They have pushed boats with poles for thousands of miles across sand flats. They have built and rebuilt skiffs from the ground up, some of which are still in use even 40 years later. They are the hands of a man who has never had an email address. It is the spring of 2011, and I'm on my first trip for tarpon. The weather is perfect, sun with no clouds, a light breeze. The tarpon are in, Huff says. I'm a bit too jazzed. Sleep the night before had proven nearly impossible. We come to a stop in the Boca of a river, the engine cut, the wash shooshing against the stern. Huff tilts the motor, grabs the push pole, and climbs up on his platform. I stand and walk to the bow, fly rod in hand. My knees scrape against the raised casting platform that I feel a bit too clumsy to ascend just yet. This Boca is where Bloody Watson, the real-life murderer and outlaw fictionalized by Peter Matheson, once lived. Huff tells me this as he begins to pole the boat, slowly and deliberately, never taking his eyes off the water. He spots a tarpon. It's lying there near the surface, a serene 6-foot beast at rest. My mind empties swiftly. It's something we all seek to achieve, this purposeful clearing of the brain. Some find it via alcohol, drugs, sex, yoga. Some of us fish for it. The fish is facing left. I cast there tentatively, aiming for a spot maybe a foot in front of her nose. I instead landed on her head. The fish flushes, pushing a boat-sized wake. It's no problem, Huff says. There are more around. We find another one, again, within minutes, and I screw up that cast too. Then we find another, and I blow it again. A few tarpon roll in the distance. That I'm here on the water with Huff at all is a bit of a fluke. I had written a story about him the prior winter, and we'd spent some time in the boat together. We'd hit it off, but for decades he had a static list of 12 people he fishes with each year. He once turned down a fishing request from George H.W. Bush. After a trip, a client once gave him a condominium as a tip. But this week, as fortune had it, one of his regulars couldn't make his appointed trip and suggested that I go in his stead. And here I am. Huff describes tarpon as heroin. He has been now for decades perhaps the world's foremost dealer in this fish drug. A prominent magazine once described him as the best fishing guide alive. He is, even now, some 50-plus years into his career, a legend among legions of guides. Their DiMaggio, still in his prime. He says his only job is to make an angler's dream come true. He plays the role of coach/mentor/psychologist, which all great guides must, with aplomb. I have now blown 3 great shots at tarpon. By all rights, I should be a slobbering mess, fit for the funny farm, but I'm not. We're going to get one, he says. I believe him. Later in the day, I finally make a good cast right in front of the bigger member of a brace of laid-up tarpon. I get no response from the fish, but I'm buoyed by the act, like a golfer in the midst of a bad round who finally feels something click on one swing. Right there, to the left, I see it. A monster fish has gulped air and then remained floating near the water's surface. I make the cast immediately without any thought, make one strip, and then feel a pull I will never forget. Before I can even process what's going on, the she-tarpon clears the water behind us. Images of the moment come to me now in bits and pieces. I see the water part when the fish bites the fly. I see Huff somehow duck his head under my fly line, avoiding a clotheslining as it slices through the air over him, as tight as a guitar string. Half an hour into the fight, I realize that my face has been contorted into a rictus, the open-mouthed grimace of the dead. I'm pulling on the fish, trying to follow Huff's instructions, yet I can't seem to get the upper hand. My back is numb, my shins and knees rubbed raw by the casting platform that I'm leaning into. I understand at that moment why people say they sometimes give up while fighting a big tarpon, that it's easier to get a few jumps from one like this and then break it off and call it a day. But I can't do that. This is my first. She pulls the boat and its 2 occupants upriver a mile or so to a mangrove-lined feeder creek, barely big enough to fit us all. This is maybe where she grew up. I notice that Huff has put on a pair of orange landing gloves. The fight has taken 2 hours. I'm embarrassed, but not enough to stop. The line has begun to come apart, its coating stripped off by submerged mangrove roots. Huff tells me that Billy Pate once fought a tarpon for more than 12 hours. Pate would have been a lousy fishing partner. I swear to myself that I will get better at this someday. She finally comes up, leading with her huge prehistoric-looking mouth. Huff holds her for a moment and removes the fly. He moves her a bit in the water, reviving her. She shoots off with a kick of her tail. Huff removes his gloves to shake my hand. "Congratulations," says the dream maker. Waves of relief and exhaustion nearly bring me to my knees. My lower back throbs in pain. My shirt is soaked through with sweat, and I feel like puking from the dehydration. My right hand is grotesquely stuck in a curl, as if still holding the rod handle. I cannot wait to do it all over again. Thank you. Can I answer questions?
So we're going to do a Q&A now.
Doing
If
it.
anyone has any questions, we've got Julianne's over there, Cappy, and myself.
So raise your hand.
Yeah, just raise your hand if you have a question.
No questions?
There we go.
We got one right here.
Here we go.
So, what was the most interesting story about one of these famous fishermen that you left out of the book?
Everyone always asks me that. It's so funny. I don't think I left any. There were some that I couldn't sort of validate, that I couldn't. That people would tell me, and I'd try to figure out whether it was true. The old rule of thumb at Forbes was you needed 3 people. I know, but one must maintain one standard. You needed 3 people to kind of validate a fact or whatever, or especially if it's a rumor or innuendo, right? So there are a couple things that didn't pass that test, but pretty much I put it all in there. Put it all in there. All the Bobby Era stuff and the Billy Pate stuff, and so it was in there.
Any
Yes,
other
Tom.
questions? Oh, yeah, Tom. Let me get you the microphone.
Would you speak a little bit about the decline of that fishery and how it's related to the development that dried up the source of fresh water
Yep.
that fed the blue crabs that brought those big tarpon in?
Absolutely. This is an important story too, because it's happened all over this state, but also kind of everywhere in the United States. But Homosassa, it was believed that this sort of subset of these enormous tarpon came to Homosassa Bay because it was full of blue crabs. There were, I think I looked it up, like in the 70s, about 50 to 60 crabbers who were there. And it was just a crabbing town, pretty much. And that they came there, and they sort of reinforced itself, that they came there because the crabs were there, and then they got so fat because all these crabs were there. And then as development started, for a little while, the 2 counties that are on Homosassa Bay were the fastest growing counties in the country, and the fastest growing counties obviously in Florida as well, which meant development and golf courses and all this kind of stuff. And this is known as the Springs Coast. There are 4 spring-fed rivers that empty into Homosassa Bay along with hundreds of little tiny springs. And so every new development would just put a straw down into there was no regulation. They just put straw right down in the aquifer and just start sucking it up. And I can't remember it's in the book, but anyway, there was something like in the 70s when the guys first discovered Homosassa, there were like 2 golf courses, and then all of a sudden, 20 years later, there were 40 or something like that. Don't hold me to that, but it's a huge number. But anyway, so the fresh water started drying up. Now, you might not think that tarpon need fresh water, but they do in this sense, as the blue crabs they mate in the fresh water. So they needed the fresh water. The fresh water dried up, the crabs went away, and then the tarpon went away. And this is a little bit of a less of a problem on that coast, but on other coasts of Florida, every time that a bunch of mangroves is bulldozed over to put in a condominium, you've just killed habitat for baby tarpon. They all like to, kind of grow up in this kind of brackish water that is frequently surrounded by mangroves. So that's pretty much the story of Homosassa. So I went there probably 4 or 5 times with Tom and with some of the other characters. And what to me, I have recency bias. I would go out there and we'd see 2 or 3 fish, and they were huge, and I'd be like, oh my God, this is the best place ever. But it wasn't. Back in the 70s, it was thousands of fish like that. So it's kind of a cautionary tale, I feel like. I don't know what can be done, but there's certainly a cautionary tale within it.
Anyone else? I have something, Monty. I wanted to just comment and get your view. I thought it was really fascinating how there were so many strong literary minds involved in those early days of tarpon.
That and artists. I think you could put them all under. Russell Chatham was a painter, and Broad again, the poet, and it was really interesting. So there's one chapter in there where I talk about the merry pranksters of the tarpon world, which was Tom and his group down in Key West. And the more I thought about it, I don't know, Tom probably has some thoughts on this too, but it seemed to me that the goal of an artist is try to explain the unexplainable, sort of. In a lot of ways, not only a writer but also a painter tries to do that. And tarpon fishing seemed to me to be some sort of metaphor for that. Like it was kind of blowing their minds, a little bit. as they were fishing for it. And I think you could see the influence of, he was there with Jim Harrison and Russell Chatham and Tom. We'll stop with those guys, but you could see the influence I think that time in Key West had in all of your work. Certainly see it in your angling writing, but also in some of your novels. And Harrison, I feel like, and again, you would know better, but used to use fishing as a way to blow off, steam that needed to be blown off. And Russell Chatham became known for these beautiful landscape pictures of the West, but I see a lot of key, you can kind of see the keys in there. You can kind of see that landscape as well, waterscape.
Yeah. Any other questions? Oh,
Yeah.
yes. Where is it? There we go.
You have one over here, too.
Over here, too. Okay.
Where do you go today when you want to fly fish for tarpon?
I go to the Keys every once in a while, but I mainly go fishing with Steve. And we start in Everglades City. He lives in Everglades City, but we trailer the boat. This is one of my favorite parts of this. We trailer the boat to Ted Jurassic's dock. So I usually don't see him in the morning, but Ted Jurassic founded Tibor Reels for the hardcores in here. But he'll come kind of waddling out later on. I was at fishing. He's hilarious. So yeah, so usually Everglades. I love the Everglades fishing. It's a little more crowded than it used to be, like every place is, but I like fishing for the laid up fish. I kind of like getting back in the mangroves and you literally don't know if anyone's there. For a long time, your cell phone didn't work. It would go dead if you left it on. If you didn't put it in airplane mode, it would go dead in like 2 hours because it was searching for a signal so much. So yeah, usually the Everglades.
Hi, Monty.
Hi.
I've lived here for a long time, been fly fishing here for a long time, and the cautionary tale that you speak of homosassa is something that everybody here should really pay attention to. Mm-hmm. For Boca Grande,
Yep.
The fishery here is definitely in decline, and some things are coming down the pike that I think we can all get behind, and I think we should all just really pay attention, and hopefully we can help those fish that we all love.
100% agree. Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
No one else? No one has a Nick Saban question? I always get a Nick Saban question. That's right. So now he's not a neighbor. You guys are done with him, huh?
Well, Monty, you have some books here for sale, and I know people have been buying it. So you're going to sign some books for us?
Yep.
We'll have you sign right here.
Okay.
That way people can chat a little bit. And
Okay.
Are there any last-minute questions?
Oh, there's one way in the back.
Back there. Yep.
Any teaser or what you're working on now?
I'm not working on it. Well, I've been asked to do a collection of my fishing stories. I don't know. I have to kind of count them up, make sure I've got enough. I don't know what the minimum would be. 20 or so, I guess. I got to make sure I got enough good ones, I guess. But I'm working on another college football book, actually, right now, which I can't disclose.
Oh. Just us, just this small group.
Just this small group? All right. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, Monty, I want to give you one of our book bags. You have to have one of these,
Right.
all right?
Thank you. Yeah, we need this
Thank you
today,
so
actually.
much, Monty.
Of course.
Very good, very good.
Thank you.